All right, we're going to begin with part 3 of the Black Jews of Africa. Get into chapter 3, the Mythography of Africa. What did people in the early medieval times really know about Africa and Africans? Almost nothing. Through geographical errors and confusion between India and Ethiopia and Africa, biblical traditions about the presence of Jews in the land of the son of Cush, the legend of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and the location of Ophir in Africa came to be set pieces in the repertoire of Jewish and Christian ethnography of Africa. Use of the term Ethiopia up to the 16th century was characterized by geographical errors and confusion between India and Ethiopia in Africa. India, for geographers of the late Latinity, was a land of Asia divided into 3 areas on the 2 shores of the Indian Mediterranean. For Greco-Latin authors and their medieval successors, with such uncertain and inaccurate data, Ethiopia characterized the part of the African continent inhabited by dark-skinned people. Ethiopia is thus defined by its population whose skin color would be essential for the elaboration of the images of Ethiops. Through travelers, merchants, or missionaries, contacts with Africa other than North Africa were rare until the 15th century, due to both natural obstacles, such as sea and desert, and to the political and cultural barrier of Islam. In the High Middle Ages, the Eastern world beyond Islam was therefore practically unknown, and from the conquest of Egypt by the Muslims in AD 641, Africa and the Indian Ocean were beyond the horizon of Western Christians. Their source of knowledge about Africa was therefore essentially books. The Bible and the classical writings, mainly Homer, Herodotus, Pliny, and Ptolemy, whose texts provided the medieval Christians with knowledge and interpretations about Africa. Some of the embryonic notions from which the Western imagination developed its myths about Africa were derived from these texts. Homer's assertion in the Odyssey that there were 2 Ethiopias, one in the west and one in the east, both at the extremities of the earth, was the basis for a number of later descriptions of Africa, beginning with Herodotus in the 5th century BC and continuing up to the 15th century. It introduced the concept of 2 Africas. Homer's description, albeit mythical, was nevertheless inspired by 2 historical realities: the powerful Cushitic Empire of Meroe on the Nubian Nile, whose inhabitants were perceived as being very civilized, the admirable Ethiopians of the east, opposed to the nomadic tribes of the Saharan and sub-Saharan regions, who became the other Ethiopians of the west, and who are often represented as being savage, bestial, and treacherous. Homer's Ethiopians who live somewhere where Hyperion sits and the others where it rises were probably inspired by historical reality on which the myth of the 2 Ethiopias were based on the ancient European image of Africa. This notion was taken up again by Herodotus, who followed the Nile to Aswan around 440 BC and described Meroe's Ethiopians as the tallest and most beautiful men in the whole world, and as being cunning but peace-loving, whereas far away from them in the southwest live creatures with dog heads, creatures without heads, whose eyes, according to the Libyans, are on their chests, and also wild men and women, and many less fabulous beasts. In the 1st century BC, Diodorus Siculus, who also visited Egypt, reinforced more schematically the division of Africa into two Ethiopias. He presented, on one hand, Merowe's Ethiopians as the first to learn how to worship the gods, and those who obviously enjoy the favor of the gods. On the other hand, he described Ethiopian tribes spreading out over the south and the west of Merowe's Ethiopia as being of black color and having flat noses and woolly hair, totally savage, and exhibit a nature of wild beasts. Through a theory alleging the existence somewhere of the antipodes of the West and the antipodes of the South, the Church Fathers reiterated the allegorical processes used by the ancients and adapted it to their own vision of the world and to the theological concerns. In short, the known side of Africa was considered more or less an extension of Christendom, the unknown, the epitome of barbarism. The lack of knowledge of Ptolemy's works seemed to have definitely associated the science of the stars and astral religion. Cartography remained very dependent on such ideas and produced essentially a symbolic image rather than precise geographical information when mapping Africa. This vision is well reflected in the famous Hereford's Mapamundi, dated 1290, whose symbolic world reveals an allegorical vision of the judgment and shows the damned being taken away to the southern end of a crescent-shaped Africa toward monstrous creatures with a single foot or eye. During the 14th and 15th centuries, these traditions were merged in the portolans produced by Arabian geographers for European monarchs. The maps of this period, as for example Martin Behaim's Globe 1492, exhibit remarkable realism of the African coastlines, while simultaneously providing more symbolic representation of the interior of the continent. It is not surprising to see that the Portuguese vision of Africa at the beginning of the 15th century was largely influenced by the notion of two completely distinct Ethiopias, due to the strong tradition of the survival of a Christian kingdom at the sources of the Nile, identified with Prester John's kingdom. Portuguese emissaries went in search of this great and remote empire with the conviction that they were Christianity's witnesses. When the enterprise failed with the banishment of the Jesuits in the 17th century, the whole image of a fabulous empire was transferred for a while to Monomotopa's empire with its abundance of gold and precious stones. The notion of a welcoming paradise on earth coexisted with a barbarian Africa flowed through history and literature and can be found again and again in numerous fictional journeys, such as that of Mandeville, as well as in 19th century adventure novels such as those of Ritter Haggard or John Buchan. Malvern Van Wyck Smith writes, "Thus Homer's division, nourished by a European propensity towards binary thinking, continued to develop in the most powerful of European myths about Africa, growing over the centuries into the elaborate ameliorative mythologies of a terrestrial paradise at the sources of the Nile beyond the mountains of the moon. into the legends associated with Prester John at Abyssinia, of Monomotopa, of Sofala, or Zimbabwe as King Solomon's Ophir. The literature produced by the colonization and exploration of Africa maintained dramatically this polarity of perception. Africa was reified both as a geographical topos and as an imaginary space. This is perhaps best typified in the evolution in the course of the 19th century of a myth known as the Hamitic hypothesis. In a familiar dualistic movement, this modern myth as asserted that light-skinned people of Caucasoid origins had in time past spread across Africa, where they were capable of developing a high civilization, which is fraudulent. The myth maintained that they were dramatically different from the Negroid savage local people with whom they gradually interbred before degenerating. This was the explanation put forward by early ethnologists and historians for the apparent decline of a number of great African kingdoms, such as the Yoruba land or Great Zimbabwe. This view persisted forcefully into the 20th century. The influential British anthropologist Charles Seligman, in his well-known Races of Africa in 1930, maintained the difference between the Negroid agricultural Africans and the Europeans' pastoral Hamites. He was echoed by Leo Frobenius and various other anthropologists, paving the way to subsequent identifications, so known as the forms of white supremacy. So that's it for chapter 3. Stay tuned for chapter 4 of the Black Jews of Africa on the legend of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Give thanks for tuning in once again. This is Wyndham J. Salam.